So life has felt a bit like this lately, hasn't it? A long, dark road, no end in sight, occasional excitement when you go out to get your morning takeaway coffee or maybe go to the supermarket. That's a lot like it was to be in agri-food tech 10 years ago. My colleague Rob famously called it a backwater of venture capital. The investments were few and far between. There were just one or two dedicated venture capital firms focused on the industry. Food tech was barely a coined term back then. Agriculture was named the least digitized industry in the world. And that is right around the time when I started focusing on agriculture in late 2013. Agtech had had its first big exit. Monsanto had acquired Climate Corporation for $1 billion. So it did have that. But other than that, most of my coverage was for farmland funds and the occasional private equity deal. Yet moving over from writing about equities and bonds and institutional investment in Asia, I immediately saw the appeal. It was a far more tangible asset class than the other markets I've been covering. And this was feed the world stuff. So fast forward to today, and it's clear that other people share my view. This image is much more appropriate for today in agri-food tech. Obviously, a lot of us are not able to do this in person today, but when you look at what this industry is, we're all having this massive party virtually. There are robots on farms. We're growing food inside of grocery stores and underground. We're eating real meat made in a lab, or more realistically, a fermenter, but you get the point. We also have publicly listed companies in the plant-based space. Beyond Meat listed last year. Vertical farming companies are public companies like AeroFarms will soon be. Gene editing companies. Food delivery is everywhere. If you don't have your coffee with a dairy-free alternative, I don't know what you're doing. Although maybe saying that to your New Zealand audience is a little bit controversial. The thesis has shifted a bit. So no longer is the sole focus of this industry on producing more with less for a growing population. But innovators, investors are thinking really carefully about how they're creating food, what they're producing with human and planetary health in mind. And overall, more and more people are coming to the agri-food tech party, and it's very exciting. In fact, 2020 was by far and away the biggest year ever for investment in food tech, ag tech. A lot of that growth was down to mature growth stage deals, so larger and larger deals, because this industry is maturing. So some of those brands that you all know and perhaps love are now late stage ventures, raising really large rounds and pushing totals up. So some of those include Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Eat Just, AeroFarms, Climate Corporation, Farmers Edge, Conservice, Ginkgo Bioworks, Pivot Bio. They were all founded in 2010 or before. So they're all over 10 years old. That 2015 year really was a year that was a breakout year that put food tech and ag tech on the map. And two areas that particularly raised a lot of money were food delivery and farm software, particularly drones, remote sensing. This prospect and potential of transferring technology from other industries into agriculture and food for the first time was so exciting. And in theory, relatively straightforward, right? So take drones. We can give farmers a view of their fields they've never seen before. In practice, farmers were drowning with so-called pretty pictures of their farm that could only tell them what had already happened when it was too late. It soon became apparent that the ultimate goal and value-added proposition was to alert farmers to problems on their field before they became unsolvable, while they still had time to act. So we started to see the complicated nuance of agriculture, an industry based on organic goods, natural resources, weather, became really apparent, and many innovators were not prepared for that. So investment in drones dropped off. And actually, a lot of drone companies pivoted away from agriculture into less complicated industries like construction, mining, and urban planning. Food delivery, which also had this huge boom in investment in 2015, and of course today is ubiquitous, particularly in a post-pandemic world. But it also went through a rough ride. Again, it was more complicated than many people thought. The unit economics were super tough. Consumers didn't necessarily want differentiated offerings. So there were a lot of Me Too products out there. consumers just really wanted the largest selection possible and quick delivery. Well, the logistics around that are super hard and it comes at a cost. And so there were also a lot of failures in food delivery after 2015 too. So if we look here at the Gartner hype cycle, I would say that 2015 was the peak of inflated expectations for drones and food delivery. And now they're probably moving into the plateau of productivity, but with some adjustments. So for drones with remote sensing, it's highly unlikely you're going to see a standalone drone product for this. They're now part of a broader analytics offering alongside various other data sources like satellite imagery, soil data, weather data, and so on. A newer development with drones that was more of a distant hope back in 2015 is using them for tasks on the farm like spraying and harvesting. In Asia, where getting large equipment into the field is harder and less relevant, crop spraying drones are revolutionary. And we're seeing particular strides in China. Just this week, there was a $30 million deal for a Chinese agricultural drone, crop spraying drone, backed by some big government investors. There are still some challenges around regulation and the amount of product a drone can carry, but it's improving all the time. Key for innovators to remember is that farmers don't want to be messing around too much with robots, needing to put them back onto charge all the time, needing to keep them in line of sight. They need a certain amount of autonomy. Food delivery, while as I mentioned, obviously is everywhere, still actually struggles from a sustainable business model. You only need to look at the IPO of Deliveroo recently over here in the UK, where investors balked at the company's treatment of its drivers when they were thinking about their ESG metrics. And that shaved $1 billion off its valuation. No doubt its investors still performed very well from the IPO though. So moving on to 2016, one category that's always had column inches and attention far greater than its actual impact has been vertical farming. I remember back in 2016, I knew any article that we wrote about vertical farming and indoor ag would be the best read of the week, just guaranteed. It captured people's imaginations. It's super nerdy, it's kind of sci-fi. But in reality, I just read this week and I was really quite surprised. Vertical farming is the equivalent of just 30 hectares of farmland globally. So if you compare that to outdoor cultivation, where there's 50 million hectares cultivated, and in greenhouses, there's 500,000 hectares, it's still super, super small. Significant challenges still remain today, mainly around costs and energy efficiency. Having said this, I have noticed a turning point in recent months, which is quite exciting. Indoor farms are now growing new crops. So, there's been a bit of a fatigue around the fact that it's always been leafy greens. We're seeing a lot more vertical farms doing more research into different crops. Strawberries and tomatoes are increasingly common, but they're also researching into breeding, how they can breed outdoor crops to be grown inside. We're also seeing the technology become more sophisticated and automated. One of our portfolio companies called Intelligent Growth Solutions, they have great innovation around electricity and making that more efficient. And they're growing super fast. IGS, again, for instance, has 26 grow systems in place today, but they're expecting to triple that by the end of the year. Bowery, a New York-based plant factory vertical farm, has just built a farm 100 times the size of its first one. So this is not theoretical anymore. Vertical farming is being included in policy directives of governments such as the UK, Singapore, Middle East. And it's set to grow to about $20 billion in about 5 to 6 years' time. So if you think about the hype cycle again, we're probably on the slope of enlightenment. It's probably a very shallow slope, but it's an upward slope nonetheless. Moving on to 2017 and 2018, I think a big buzzword of those years was blockchain, which was always quite hard for me to understand why you would need blockchain when there was still so much more of the food supply chain to be digitized before then. Farmers were or still are using notepads. Drivers in haulage trucks are using notepads hanging in the cab. And I think this quote from Olam, one of the largest supply chain companies in the world, really, sums it up. We have not seen a tangible, scalable use case that could give us significant benefits for adopting blockchain. That was in 2018. The situation might be different now, but I will say that we did notice quite a big drop-off in startups focusing on that area after that initial buzz. So what about the last couple of years and today? So this slide could give you a hint. What do all these celebrities have in common? They've all invested in alternative protein startups. We can't have a talk about food tech and ag tech without bringing up alternative protein. Excitement here is huge, it's fever pitch. And it is possible that we might be heading for a bubble. Data has shown that investment in alt meats in 2020 reached a record high of 3 billion. It's increased its market share substantially across food tech and ag tech, 3% increase in market share just between 2019 and 2020. And the Boston Consulting Group has predicted that alt meat could comprise 11% of the protein market by 2035. Similarly, Food Dive has reported that self-identified meat eaters dropped from 85% in 2019 to 71% in 2020. Impossible Foods was only in 150 grocery stores last February and is now in 17,000. So that's a 100-fold increase. That can be attributed to some of the supply chain disruptions in the meat supply chain during COVID and also rapidly expanding production capacity. But if the success of the industry is against its impact on meat consumption, it's not doing quite as well. Sales of meat were still up 19.2% in the past year, including beef from Brazil, which is a high offender when it comes down to chopping down forests for ranching. Big meat has yet to commit to reducing livestock production, and there are some significant challenges ahead. Some of those for startups. So some of those include competition from some of the big meat companies. So the big meat companies are putting a lot of money into creating copycat plant-based products. Some of them even have very similar names. And if you think about their supply chain and the amount of supply of the raw ingredients, which can be a challenge, getting supply of pea protein has certainly been a challenge for some startups. That could be quite dangerous competition for some entrepreneurs. Scalability, supply, the environmental footprint of alternatives. There's an assumption that it is more environmentally friendly, and in most cases it absolutely is. But I read recently this week that air transported fruit and vegetables can create more greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram than poultry, for example. So something for people to be aware of. Regulation and consumer acceptance are still unknowns, particularly when it comes to the use of genetic engineering for some of these products and the health profile of them as well. I think that there's been a little bit of consumer backlash around the amount of processing in some of these products and whether they're nutritionally equivalent to their animal-based counterparts. And also more philosophically, there remains a question of whether, expanded activity and investment in this industry is reshaping a problematic food system or just building up a parallel one. So how do you weather that potential dip into the trough of disillusionment? I'm not an economist, but I can tell you how we have an investment fund focused on alternative proteins at Agfunder and how they think about it. And I think this could be translated into other categories as well, not just alternative proteins. So diversity is key. They're going to invest in about 15 to 20 investments in a $20 million fund. They're going to surround themselves with the best investors. So sometimes when categories get a bit more hypey, a bit more bubbly, you can have slightly rude, but dumb money comes in, less educated money in the industry. So you ensure that you do deep due diligence on the companies, which some of these less expert VCs cannot do. You ensure that the companies you invest in have commercial acumen to get to market fast. When there's all this competition going on, you want them to be making revenues as soon as possible. And you ensure that these companies are future proofing, thinking about their customers of the future, imagining millennials as parents. So what's next? What are some of the next areas of excitement? Food as medicine is an area that I find really exciting. If you think about in the US, 88% of the population is metabolically unhealthy. So that means they have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes or pre-diabetes. That's 88%. So they are all of them thinking in today's context at high risk of complications from COVID-19 compared to the 12% who are deemed metabolically healthy. Now, we all know that kale, spinach, and the like are good for us. There are studies showing that people in diets that are low in plants, fruits, nuts, and seeds are 3 times more likely to die prematurely than those with diets that are high in those things. But what we don't really know is how or why. One of our portfolio companies is delving into that and researching how the presence of certain compounds called phytonutrients can be beneficial to human health. You've got companies researching medicinal plants to use those in all proteins. You've got others delivering meals that are exactly attuned to your health needs and goals and ailments. And so then that gets into personalization, which is another trend that's been on the horizon for a while, but looks set to accelerate more now as research into the gut microbiome improves and nutrition science slowly but steadily improves. A company that's interesting in personalization is called Project Well. And then last but not least, the buzzword of 2021 is probably carbon markets and regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture was something I've actually covered back in 2014 when I was writing more about sort of farmland investment. And back then there was already a dedicated group of practitioners and investors, but it was a very small universe. And I remember writing about it and really wanting it to, have this like huge following of readers. Unfortunately, not so. As it wasn't quite the same as writing about drones back then. But skip forward to 2019, I think, is where I suddenly saw this change. And regenerative agriculture became this phrase that people were using more and more. Food brands have started to use it as well. It's not just people within our universe. This is becoming a phrase used by consumers. And articles that we wrote about it were going viral, finally. Startups started to introduce it into their marketing. And it now goes hand in hand with the discussion around carbon markets. So today I'm seeing lots of companies, on the farm software side are pivoting slightly to provide carbon measurement and incentivization technologies, and the potential for farmland to sequester carbon from the atmosphere is really great. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about this in the next couple of days. One word of caution, as it seems that this might be creating a bit of a bubble, is that there are still quite a few unknowns. And there are many differences that can make the modeling inaccurate, complex, and maybe unrealistic. I saw a quote from a researcher from Wageningen in the Netherlands, and he was saying that he is very worried that the amounts that people are saying that of carbon that could be sequestered by farming are vastly overestimated. Carbon capture can also be temporary. So while you might capture it one year, it could get released through practices later on. So for this reason, a lot of research groups, such as the World Resources Institute, have completely left out the potential for carbon sequestration when they've done their forecasts for what carbon emissions are going to look like in the coming years. I think that's understandable. I think it's a shame to write it off so quickly. There's so much focus today on the negatives of farming and not really enough focus on where the industry is doing things right. So I think I would hope, agriculture is not going anywhere soon. Let's celebrate and encourage best practices where we see them and think creatively about how to fix the food system's impact on the planet. And while, I think we might be headed for a bit of a bubble in the carbon sphere for, similar reasons to drones, really, the understanding of this very complex industry, how plants and soil sequester and store carbon, in different soil types, different climates, it still, seems a bit early on that front. But the good news, and ever the optimist, and where I'm going to end, is that agri-food tech now has this groundswell of investors, right? It's a much larger investor base than it used to be. They have already come up the complex learning curve and will ask the right questions of entrepreneurs in this space. So that's my whistle-stop tour. I did mention some key areas of innovation, such as biotechnology, gene editing, microbial discovery. I didn't delve into robotics as much, which really is starting to happen now. They're out on the farm. But I hope that was a good snapshot.
So one of my questions, so many comments, so many thoughts you've just provoked. First of all, 88%, did you say, of the US population
metabolically unhealthy? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's not a question. That's just I couldn't let that
terrifying.
pass.
Yeah, only 12% are metabolically healthy.
Okay. Here's my first question. You mentioned 85 to that the people who self-identify as meat eaters has gone from 85 to 71%. But at the same time, we're seeing a 19.2%, almost a 20% increase in sales of meat. How do you reconcile those two stats?
That's a great point. I think there's a little bit of meat shaming. Is that the word? I think I saw that trending on Twitter this week. So there's this recipe site in the US called Epicurious, and this week they decided they're not going to put any meat into no meat recipes on their site, which is wild. And so yeah, there's this big trend around meat shaming. So I wonder if that research into people that don't identify themselves as meat eaters, perhaps it's how they want to identify themselves, but also meat consumption is growing. I mean, I'm not sure if that figure was for the US or if it was for global, but meat consumption is growing. Middle classes in parts of the world that didn't used to be able to afford to buy meat are now buying meat. And that's why this has been flung, into the spotlight as an area that was really important to tackle, this increasing demand for protein.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about the meat shaming, because I don't know if any of the people on this call followed, but Joe Biden came out with his climate plan. Someone in an article somewhere had cited a study that suggested that it would be a good idea for meat consumption to go down to 4 pounds a year or something like that. And that somehow got spun into a complete misrepresentation of Joe Biden's climate plan, that he was saying he was going to limit people to 4 pounds a year, which was not the case at all. And so there was a huge backlash in right-wing media of saying, how dare you try to cut off my hamburgers? I'm going to be eating a 4-pound steak tonight alone. So I feel like there's a thing here. When we talk about meat shaming, there's a thing here for us to be aware of, which is how our cultural identification with meat consumption and how that might impact investment and market demand and consumer trends. All right, so I'm going to go to a few questions from our audience. We got a question. We'll start with Diane. Diane's question is, with the growing popularity of regenerative agriculture, is there concern about it being greenwashed, and have you seen that happen yet?
Yeah, well, I think there is a concern about that for sure. And when I mentioned that I thought potentially there was a bubble forming in this whole concept of carbon markets as well, it does seem that it suddenly was this tag that a lot of brands and companies were putting, I don't know if they're putting them onto their foods, although there is, potential labeling around that. But sure, I think absolutely. And I think because it's hard, it takes a long time to transition to those practices. It's not something that farmers overnight are suddenly regenerative farmers. It's super complicated, and they have to change a huge amount about what they're growing each year and how they're doing it, and completely change their business models. So certainly there is greenwashing happening. I think people are very concerned that the sanctity of the regenerative agriculture phrase and everything is getting muddied. And that's why I think it's really important that we see the science catch up, the technology catch up, and really that the measurements are done across the world, different soil types and so on, that we can really prove that these practices work and how they work, and have, some guidelines around it. And whether that means we want governments involved or not, I'm not really sure. I'm always interested to hear how companies view that. Often, they take matters into their own hands, but you do have companies that are doing all of it. They're doing the measuring, they're actually helping the farmers change their practices, but then they've also got the carbon market and they're incentivizing the farmers on the other end. Feels a little bit like that's kind of open to potential kind of fraud and stuff, because you've got the same companies incentivized to sell the carbon markets. They're the same ones that are doing the measuring and so on. I don't know, maybe that's a bit unfair, but we could be going down a bit of a scary road in some ways.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, another question. Tracy is asking, one of the limitations currently in New Zealand for the adoption of tech is the lack of sharing of data between organizations. Do you have any advice on how we can move our agri sector forward on data sharing?
Interesting. And is that organizations as in farming organizations or just across?
I'm assuming she means farming. Tracy, is that what you're meaning? Like farmers reluctant to share data across?
Yeah. Because I don't think that's just in New Zealand. I think that's in other parts of the world as well, right? Farmers can be super private. Around data ownership, she says. Yeah. It's interesting, right? So when, on our phones, you have the data sharing, right? So like Instagram is like reading all of my data, and then it's targeting me with super relevant adverts. And if I find that valuable, then I'm like, okay, I don't really care about sharing data with them. As soon as like it's something that's going to be valuable to you and you notice that, I think people are going to be okay with it. So it might say something more about what the data-led products are offering farmers than whether they're happy with their privacy. At the end of the day, a lot of this data is going into like a whole big system. It's very unlikely someone's going to go in and pinprick X farmer to like take advantage of his data, specifically him, single him out or her. So yeah, I think it's about the value proposition of these tools and making sure that farmers think it's worth sharing their data.
Yeah, and of course, we complain about if people say, "Can I have your data?" We're like, "Oh no, that would be terrible." But if people are like, "Hey, do you want to share this photo? Do you want to answer this quiz with all of your personal information so I can tell you which Lord of the Rings character you are?" Then people are like, "Oh yeah, 100%."
Right, exactly. Do you want to like photocopy my face? But
yeah.
But I will say, a lot of this information they already know. So there are a few companies out there that are using satellite imagery to help with like the rental market. I don't know if you saw, there was like quite a bit of controversy over here with a company that essentially is using data to help people identify good acquisitions, farmland acquisitions. And they literally know everything from as much as how much rainfall that particular farm had, if it's got any issues with water rights or drainage. I mean, they could literally know a whole host of information just from satellite imagery and from public records of local regions, So in some ways, it's almost like a losing battle. But they could use it to try and make the tools better. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, we experienced the same thing with the COVID app, where people are like, "I'm not telling you where I am," but it's like everybody knows where you are already. Google knows where you are, Apple knows where you are. So, okay, I've got a question, which is towards the end you talked about alternative proteins. Earlier in the talk, you'd referenced the Gartner hype cycle. Where would you say alternative proteins are on the Gartner hype cycle? And I'm going to expand on that question just slightly.
It's a really hard one.
Yeah, if we knew in advance where we were. I had a meeting recently. Actually, it's a different question. So I'm going to just pause it. Where do you think we are in terms of alternative proteins on the Gartner hype cycle?
Gosh, I don't know. This is really hard. Maybe we're not even on it because consumption of these products is increasing. Production of these products is increasing. Maybe for investors. So if we think about the Gartner hype cycle for investors, perhaps we are nearing the peak of inflated expectations because of some of those challenges that I mentioned around competition, supply, regulation, and so on. Maybe a lot of them come up against some big hurdles that they can't get past. And some of the large groups that are already out there are just so far ahead that they're dominating the market. So maybe from an investment standpoint, perhaps we're at the peak because valuations have just shot up and are crazy. So maybe it's not a great investment right now.
All right. We'll hold you to it. Louisa
no, please
don't. No, we won't. I'm joking. Okay. We have a question from Peter Renhilton, who says, first of all, great to finally get you in New Zealand, albeit virtually.
Yes,
and has the question, it would be good to get your take on climate investment strategies and how these might be impacting on global investors' view of emerging agri-food tech deal flow opportunities. If there are folks whose investment strategies are focused around climate, how is that kind of category of investment intersecting with agri-food tech deal flows? So, and is that Venn diagram quite strong? Like, does it mean that now all of a sudden there's a bunch of investment money looking for climate investment opportunities that potentially can find a home in agri-food tech?
That is a great question. I mean, I've always said, but maybe it's because I'm like the ultimate agri-food tech fan, but I've always said there is positive impact to be found throughout agtech and food tech. Like that whole concept of growing more with less, by default has a positive climate impact, right? 'Cause it's using fewer resources. And so that's been part of the thesis from day one. Having said that, I think, there just wasn't as much exposure and spotlight on this industry. There weren't as many startups. It was much riskier. We've had this first wave of startups have come through now and getting onto the second wave who are a lot more, who could accelerate more rapidly. And there's, a lot more behind them that they can point to that's successful. So I think, there's multiple ways that innovation for food tech and ag tech can be a climate investment. We've seen a lot of more impact investors where climate is one of the key focus areas. More and more of them are coming into the space. We've even launched our own impact fund based out of Singapore Grow Impact Fund, and have a ton of interest in that too. So absolutely. And I think hopefully will only increase. And obviously this whole carbon market thing is another point of focus too.
We have another question from Juliet McLean, who is a total rock star legend in the New Zealand food and fiber sector. Juliet is asking, from your side of the world, do you have a view on what the attitudes and opinions are of New Zealand agri-tech and investment opportunities here, or are we not even on the radar? We want to know, what do you think of us? This is like the number one New Zealand question. If any tourist who comes to New Zealand ever, we're like, what do you think of New Zealand? This is basically that question. And
yeah. Well, you have one of the most established ag tech accelerators out there, right? With Sprout. They were one of the first. So I think they've certainly got their name around in the past. And I think, you're well known just from being a very advanced farming community. So I'm not sure if I can say that you're well known for like your ag tech ecosystem necessarily, but you're not completely off the map.
Awesome. So it sounds like we've got a maybe not a bad reputation, but we could do a lot more to grow the reputation.
And Peter is doing huge amounts, by the way,
yeah.
With all his associations and everything.
Peter has another question. He's really interested in your comments on vertical farming. Singapore currently produces just 10% of its food supply needs, but last year it introduced a 30-30 strategy, increasing domestic food production to 30% by 2030. Do you think this is realistic? And I guess tying those two things together is, I'm assuming, or I'm inferring from this that part of that strategy is vertical farming. Is that feasible?
Yeah, so I think it is feasible because yes, vertical farming will be a portion of that, but also they were the first to regulate and sell cultivated meat. So they approved that last November. And if you think about that, they could certainly do that on shore. I actually don't know where the cultivated chicken that Eat Just served in that Singapore restaurant was manufactured. I really should. But my guess would be they would want it to be in Singapore. So if you've got, those are two examples of technologies that can help them to get there. And generally, they've been super aggressive in their policies, super supportive of innovation to get to that level. So I think they will.
Nice. We have a question from another part of the world, Marconi, here in Portugal, part of family work in farm and agriculture. Part of his family works in farm and agriculture, but the sons don't work in the farm. And part of the story is about to die because, of course, the parents are getting older and the farm work isn't that sexy. Do you have any thoughts on heritage stories, connection to land? You're obviously agri-food tech, but there's this whole world of farming that is, has this kind of richness embedded within it. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, that generational shift is happening all over, and in emerging markets too, urbanization is a real kind of threat to the industry. I think it's sad. I mean, I think there's probably going to be a combination of much more industrialized, like larger automated farms. And then I think there's also, a lot of demand for local family farms and local farmers market and so on. It's a weird sort of dichotomy of, clean, whole foods, wanting to go down to your local farmer's market and buy your kale and so on. And on the flip side, okay, but I'm going to eat a burger that was made in a laboratory that might or may or not have genetic engineering, and there's this kind of dichotomy, and the consumers are kind of often the same, right? They care for the earth and the planet, so that's why they want to go to that local farmer who they think is a good steward of the land, and equally they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to the industry. So I think it's probably just going to continue to be a combination of that, but maybe at like biggest at sort of more polar opposite ends. I'm hopeful, again, being an optimist, I'm hopeful that, with the advent of technology and the ability to run farms increasingly in an automated way, will appeal to younger generations. Younger generations love tech, right? I mean, they grow up with it. And also if they can, do that and still have a job in the city or nearby, I don't know, maybe there's ways that it can be combined and they don't necessarily have to leave that heritage behind completely. But hopefully, not everything is necessarily going in that direction. I don't think all farms should be technologically optimized. So yeah, hopefully there's a sort of a combo.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. Okay, so my question is, if you were, obviously, you have a variety of different funds with different focus areas. We'll have people in the audience and watching this talk who are agri-food tech entrepreneurs. If you were to say, look, an area that I think, you should definitely be looking at, where would you be advising them to focus?
So for new ventures, well, I mean, I think I outlined it in the talk, right? Food as medicine, personalization. I guess I did talk about regen ag and carbon markets, and I'm not sure. I feel like maybe it's a bit early for those. I'm going to go with food as medicine, and that could be taken in many different routes. You could be an enabling technology there. You could be creating great, healthy food products. You could be, within the alternative meat space and making sure that those are better for you products as well. So I think, the health crisis, exacerbated by COVID, really is important. And think about the amazing technological innovation in this last year with getting these vaccines out. I mean, that's wild. So there's going to be a lot of great potential from that. Often technology comes from the healthcare sector into agriculture. So maybe there's some benefits to be made there.
So, I ran TEDx Christchurch for 10 years. 2014, we had a talk at TEDx Christchurch from Julia Ruckledge, Dr. Julia Ruckledge, who's a clinical psychologist, who's done randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials on the impact of micronutrients, high-dose micronutrients on depression, bipolar disorder, and with really extraordinary results. And one of the challenges that she's faced, and I think that food as medicine faces generally, is that it can be more challenging to find the business model, right? If we're going, well, the actual recommendation, you mentioned legumes, nuts, plants, like the actual recommendations are not particularly like add a new product or system. It's basically like go back to, and so, you mentioned a couple of those business models. Do you have any thoughts on how, you might feel you've kind of covered this already, but I guess how we drive that food as medicine conversation forward when it's almost like, well, you don't need to go to a gym, you could just go run and it's free. Same kind of thing. You don't need to take a pill, you just eat better, and it's not free, but it's this food's money you're spending on food anyway.
Yeah, well, it's this whole vitamin versus painkiller thing, right? And in VC, generally, they talk about make the painkiller, not the vitamin. So I guess making food as medicine position themselves as a painkiller. So like as a cure, not holding off something. And I that does depress me a bit because, you're kind of waiting till something's too late to kind of fix it. And people should be having vitamins, but then we don't always take our vitamins. I have these supplements. My sister's a nutritionist. She's given me stuff for my gut biome. I never take it because I'm not like, in pain. but I should. Whereas if I was in pain, oh my goodness, I'm definitely going to take it. So I guess, yeah, positioning it more around being a painkiller.
Louisa, has been such a great.
Thanks for my great questions, everybody.
Oh my gosh, it's been
I hope I
such a
answered them
great.
okay.
The talk itself was fantastic, and then the whole subsequent conversation it's been such an interesting hour for me. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be here. I'm sad that it had to be virtual, but hope to be there in person soon.